My name is Leo, and for 6 years, I worked as a deckhand on the Sea Serpent, a longline fishing trawler operating out of Kodiak, Alaska. The job was a relentless cycle of back-breaking labor, punctuated by moments of such profound, desolate beauty that it almost felt worth it. We chased halibut and black cod through the Gulf of Alaska and out into the deeper, emptier stretches of the North Pacific, sometimes going weeks without seeing another soul. Out there, the world shrinks to the size of your vessel. Your universe becomes the groan of the hull, the constant, whining roar of the diesel engine, the percussive crash of waves against steel, and the faces of the four other men who share that floating purgatory with you. It's a life that breeds a certain kind of person and a certain kind of superstition. Every captain has his rituals. Every crew its own set of unspoken rules. But there was one warning, an old piece of sea dog wisdom that you heard whispered from the old-timers in every port up and down the coast. Silas, our wiry, grizzled first mate who had 50 years on the water, was the first one to say it to me. He said on my very first trip, his voice low and serious over the scream of the wind. Out here, he'd said, his eyes fixed on the churning, gray horizon, if you find a boat with no one aboard, you leave it for the sea. It sounded like something out of a storybook, a spooky tale to tell the greenhorns. I laughed it off at the time, but Silas hadn't cracked a smile. He just shook his head, the sea spray clinging to his beard like ice, and went back to mending a net. He never explained it, and I never asked. You learn quickly in that life that some things are best left unexamined. Some things are just the way they are. Our captain was a man named Marcus Thorne. He was a good captain, fair, decisive, and relentlessly practical. He bought the Sea Serpent with his own money and had little patience for what he called nautical ghost stories. To Marcus, the sea wasn't a malevolent entity or a mysterious goddess. It was a resource to be managed and a force to be respected from a purely scientific standpoint. He trusted his radar, his sonar, and his weather charts, not old sailors' yarns. The rest of the crew consisted of Gene, our engineer, a quiet, bulky man who seemed to communicate better with machines than with people, and Evan, another deckhand like me. Evan was younger, barely 20, and was out here for the same reason most of us were. The money was good, and he was running from something back on land. We were a functional unit, if not exactly a family. We worked, ate, slept, and tried not to get on each other's nerves in the suffocatingly small confines of the ship. Life on the Sea Serpent was governed by a brutal, monotonous rhythm. 16-hour shifts were the norm. Your hands were perpetually raw, swollen, and stinging from the cold salt water and the rough handling of lines and hooks. The smell of bait, diesel, and fish guts became so ingrained in your senses that you ceased to notice it. You learned to sleep in a rocking bunk, to brace yourself without thinking against the constant, unpredictable lurch of the deck, to see the subtle shifts in the color of the water that hinted at what lay beneath. It was a hard life, but there was an honesty to it. The ocean didn't care about your past or your problems. It didn't judge. It was simply there, immense and indifferent, and your only job was to endure it. You learned to appreciate the small things. A hot cup of coffee that didn't immediately get cold. A rare day of calm seas when the sun broke through the perpetual gray overcast, the brief, exhilarating chaos of a full catch. We had been at sea for nearly 3 weeks on that final trip. The haul had been mediocre, and the mood on board was tense. Fuel costs were high, the price of fish was down, and Marcus was feeling the pressure. Every disappointing pull of the line seemed to carve a deeper line into his already weathered face. We were pushing farther out than usual, chasing a rumor of a fertile patch of sea that another captain had mentioned back in port. We were in the deep water, then a place on the charts that was just an empty, blue expanse. The nearest land was hundreds of miles in any direction. The water here was a different color, a dark, menacing indigo that seemed to swallow the light. It was a lonely, humbling kind of isolation. When you're that far out, you understand how truly small you are, how quickly the world could forget you ever existed. The satellite phone was spotty at best, our only real link to a life that felt a million miles away. It was during one of those long, gray afternoons, the sky and the sea seeming to merge into a single, colorless canvas, that the routine was broken. Evan was on watch, and his shout cut through the drone of the engine. It wasn't a cry of alarm, but of confusion. "Cap, you're going to want to see this." Marcus, Silas, and I joined him in the wheelhouse. Evan was pointing out at the water about a mile off our port bow. I followed his finger, squinting against the glare. At first, I couldn't see anything. There was just the endless, rolling expanse of water. Then I saw it. It was a dark shape, low in the water, bobbing listlessly on the swells. It was another boat. That alone was unusual. We hadn't seen another vessel in over a week. But as we got closer, the strangeness of the situation began to settle in. The boat was a small, independent trawler, maybe 40 or 50 feet long, a little smaller than our own. It was old, its paint peeling, rust streaking down its sides like dry blood. It was just sitting there. There were no lights on, no smoke from its exhaust, no figures on the deck. It was adrift, a ghost on the waves. Marcus grabbed his binoculars, his knuckles white as he pressed them to his face. He was silent for a long time, just watching. No name on the stern. He muttered, more to himself than to us. "AIS is off. Not responding to hails." He'd been trying the radio since we first spotted it, blasting the horn into the receiver on the Universal Distress Channel, but the only response was a wall of static. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I glanced over at Silas. He was standing by the window, his arms crossed, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He didn't need binoculars to see what was wrong. He could feel it. The silence from that boat was louder than any alarm bell. It was a dead silence, a hollow space in the world where a sound should have been. And as the gap between our vessels closed, I found myself thinking of his words, the ones I had dismissed so easily all those years ago. Out here, if you find a boat with no one aboard, you leave it for the sea. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, was already running through the possibilities. Could be engine trouble, medical emergency. Crew could have been evacuated, but even he didn't sound convinced. An evacuation would have involved a distress call, a life raft, some sign of what had happened. This was different. This was just empty. We were close enough now to circle it. The boat's name was painted on the bow, faded but still legible, Orion. Fishing nets were spooled neatly on the deck, as if ready for the next cast. A coil of rope sat undisturbed by the rail. A lone seabird was perched on the roof of its wheelhouse, watching us with a beady, indifferent eye. Everything looked normal, except for the profound and unsettling absence of people. It was a perfect picture of a working boat, but with the crew completely erased. "I'm going to take a closer look," Marcus announced, his voice tight with a mixture of professional concern and, I suspected, the lure of potential salvage. A boat like this, abandoned on the high seas, was a valuable prize. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "That's a bad idea, Marcus." "It's my duty to investigate, Silas." Marcus shot back, not taking his eyes off the Orion. "Could be people in there who need our help." "There's no one in there," Silas said. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. That boat's been given to the water. We should honor that. Marcus scoffed, but I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was a man of logic, but even he couldn't deny the palpable wrongness that seemed to radiate from the drifting vessel. The air around it felt colder, the silence heavier. It was like a tomb. Still, his pragmatism won out. The potential reward was too great, and the possibility, however slim, that he could be saving a life was a responsibility he couldn't ignore. He ordered Evan and me to prepare the skiff. My hands felt clumsy as I worked the knots, my stomach churning with a nameless dread. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to listen to Silas, to tell Marcus to turn the Sea Serpent around and steam away as fast as our engines could carry us. But I was just a deckhand. I did what I was told. As we lowered the small inflatable boat into the heaving, icy water, I took one last look back at Silas. He was still standing at the rail, watching us, his face like stone. He didn't wish us luck. He didn't say a word. He just watched, his expression one of grim resignation, as if he were watching men who were already dead. The short trip across the churning water felt like crossing a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The closer we got to the Orion, the more the feeling of wrongness intensified. The boat's stillness was unnatural. It didn't just bob on the waves. It seemed to absorb them, its scarred hull silencing the slap of the water. The air grew thick with the smell of old brine and something else, something I couldn't quite place. A faint metallic tang, like rust and ozone. Marcus was at the tiller of the skiff, his jaw set. I was in the bow, a boat hook in my hand, ready to grapple onto the Orion's rail. The silence was absolute. We were used to the constant noise of our own ship, the thrum of the engine, the creak of the gear. Here there was nothing. The lack of sound was a physical presence. It pressed in on my eardrums. We pulled alongside the hull. Rust stains wept from every bolt and porthole. Looking up at its silent, empty deck, I felt a primal fear, the kind a small animal feels when it senses a predator nearby, even if it can't see it. This boat felt like a predator. It felt like it was waiting. "All right, Leo, hook us on," Marcus ordered, his voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive quiet. I reached up with the pole, my hands shaking slightly. The moment the metal hook clanged against the Orion's steel rail, the sound was shockingly loud, a profane violation of the vessel's solemn silence. It echoed across the water, and for a half-second, I imagined something on the boat stirring in response. But there was nothing, just the endless, empty sea and the two silent ships. Marcus was the first one over the rail, his movements quick and efficient. He was all business, his training kicking in. I followed close behind, my boots thudding onto the deck with a sense of grim finality. We were here now. We were on board. The deck was slick with sea spray, but otherwise clear. Everything was secured, lashed down against the motion of the waves. It was shipshape, too shipshape. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a storm or a rogue wave that might have washed the crew overboard. "Hello," Marcus yelled, his voice carrying a forced confidence. "Anyone aboard? This is the Sea Serpent." His words were swallowed by the silence. The only reply was the mournful cry of that same seagull as it took flight from the wheelhouse roof, leaving us alone. "Check the cabins," Marcus said, his voice now a little lower. "I'll check the wheelhouse. Be careful." I made my way toward the small crew quarters, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had a sudden, virulent illness. Maybe a carbon monoxide leak had taken them in their sleep, and they'd been silently drifting for days. There had to be a logical explanation. There had to be. The door to the cabin swung inward with a low groan. The air that flowed out was stale and cold. I paused at the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. There were two bunks, both neatly made. A book lay open on one of them, its pages fluttering in the slight breeze from the open door. On a small table bolted to the floor, there was a plate with the remains of a meal, a piece of bread and some dried fish, looking like it had been left there only hours ago. A coffee mug sat next to it, a dark residue at the bottom. It was the mundanity of it all that was so terrifying. It was a scene of ordinary life interrupted. It looked like the crew had simply vanished into thin air, right in the middle of their daily routine. I stepped inside, my boots sticking slightly to the floor. I ran a hand along the wall. It was cold and clammy to the touch. A deep, resonant chill seemed to have settled into the very bones of the ship, a cold that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. I checked the small galley and the head. Everything was in its place. Utensils were clean and stowed away. Towels were folded. It was meticulous, unnervingly tidy for a working fishing boat. Most trawlers, including our own, had a layer of what Marcus called organized chaos. This was sterile. It felt less like a vessel that had been abandoned and more like a stage that had been set. Meanwhile, Marcus was in the wheelhouse. I heard him making a noise, a sharp intake of breath, and I hurried to join him. He was standing in front of the ship's main console, a look of profound confusion on his face. "Leo, look at this." I came up behind him. The ship's electronics were all dead. The radar screen was blank, the GPS dark. But that wasn't what had startled him. It was the ship's logbook, which lay open on the chart table. It was a standard issue log, with columns for date, time, position, course, and weather conditions. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand. They chronicled days of routine fishing. The weather had been calm. The catches had been average. I scanned down the page, my eyes tracing the steady progression of dates. The last entry was from 3 days ago. "Look at the final entry," Marcus said, his finger tapping the page. The handwriting was different. It was shaky, erratic, the pen having dug into the paper so hard it had almost torn through. It wasn't a log entry at all. It was just one sentence scrawled diagonally across the page. "Adheres the silence. Do not make a sound." A shiver traced its way down my spine, cold and sharp. What in God's name did that mean? "Adheres the silence." The words were nonsensical, the kind of thing a man might write in the throes of a fever or a complete mental breakdown. Below the sentence, the page was covered in a series of strange, intricate symbols, drawn with the same frantic energy. They looked like a cross between astronomical charts and some kind of ancient, forgotten alphabet. They made my eyes hurt just looking at them. "Delirium," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Hypothermia, maybe." Well, they got into some bad food. He was grasping at straws, trying to fit this chilling, bizarre scene into a framework he could understand. I wasn't so sure. I thought about the profound silence that enveloped the boat, the unnatural tidiness, the feeling of being watched. The message in a logbook didn't feel like the product of a sick mind. It felt like a warning. We found nothing else. The engine room was silent and still, the engine itself cold to the touch. There were no signs of damage, no leaks, no reason why it shouldn't be running. The fish hold was empty and clean. There were no personal effects left behind. No wallets, no pictures, no letters from home. It was as if the crew had been systematically erased from their own lives, leaving behind only this single, cryptic message. We stood on the deck of the Orion, the gray sky pressing down on us, the cold sea whispering against the hull. The logical explanations were all exhausted, and we were left with only the unsettling truth. We had no idea what had happened here. It was a complete and utter mystery. "There's nothing here," Marcus said finally, breaking the long silence. "Nothing we can do. Let's go." I felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me weak at the knees. We were leaving. We were going to get back on our own boat and leave this place behind. But then Marcus added, "We'll tow it back to port. Salvage is ours. This trip won't be a total loss after all." The dread returned, colder and sharper than before. He was going to tether us to this thing. He was going to bring it with us. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him about the feeling I had, about the cold that wasn't natural, to remind him of Silas's warning. But the words died in my throat. What could I say? That the boat felt wrong? That I was spooked by a crazy message in a logbook? He would have laughed at me. He would have called me as superstitious as Silas. So I said nothing. I just nodded and followed him back to the rail, back to the skiff. And as we pulled away from the Orion, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible, irreversible mistake. The empty boat bobbed silently in our wake, and I was certain, with a chilling sense of clarity, that whatever had taken its crew was now aware of us. We had boarded its vessel. We had read its message. We had made a sound. The process of securing the tow lines was a grim, silent affair. Evan and Jean worked with a forced efficiency, their faces tight and their movements jerky. Even they, who hadn't been aboard the Orion, could feel the wrongness of it all. The ghost ship, as Evan had started calling it, seemed to suck the warmth and sound out of the air around it. It followed behind us on a thick, heavy-duty tow cable, a dark and silent shadow tethered to our stern. Silas refused to help. He stood by the galley door, cleaning a fish with slow, deliberate motions, his knife scraping against the scales with a rhythmic, grating sound. He didn't look at any of us. His disapproval was a palpable force, a heavy blanket of condemnation that smothered the already tense atmosphere on board. Marcus ignored him, barking orders and checking the tow line's tension with a furious energy, as if staying busy could hold the encroaching dread at bay. As dusk began to settle, a deep, bruised purple spreading across the horizon, the real strangeness began. At first, it was barely perceptible, a low-frequency vibration that I felt more in the soles of my boots than I heard with my ears. It was a hum, deep and resonant, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I paused on the deck, tried to place it. I thought it might be our own engine, maybe a bearing going bad in the gearbox. I went below to find Gene in the engine room. The air was hot and thick with the smell of diesel. Gene was wiping his hands on a rag, his face beaded with sweat. The roar of the Sea Serpent's engine was deafening down here, a familiar and comforting noise. "You feel that?" I yelled over the din. "That humming sound?" Gene gave me a quizzical look. "I don't hear anything but this old beast," he shouted back, patting the engine block. "What's it sound like?" I tried to describe it, but it was difficult. It was less a sound and more a feeling, a pressure against my eardrums. It was unnervingly regular, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was slow, like a colossal heartbeat. Finding no answers in the engine room, I went back on deck. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the sea and sky were cloaked in a deepening twilight. The hum was more noticeable out here, away from the immediate thunder of our own engine. Evan was at the stern, staring back at the Orion, which was now just a black silhouette against the fading light. "You hear that, right?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "I do now." The sound was coming from the other boat. There was no doubt about it. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was there, a deep, monotonous, pulsating hum. It was impossible. We had been through the Orion from bow to stern. Her engine was cold. Her electronics were dead. There was nothing on that ship capable of making a sound like that. "Must be the way the water's moving through the rudder," Marcus said later that night in the galley, when Evan brought it up. He was hunched over a bowl of stew, but he wasn't eating, or the wind whistling through a vent. "It's an old boat. It's going to make noises." He was rationalizing again, finding the logical explanation. But his explanation didn't fit. This wasn't a random creak or groan. It was a steady, rhythmic, almost organic pulse. It felt deliberate. It felt alive. That night, sleep was impossible. The sound seemed to penetrate the steel hull of our ship, vibrating up through my bunk, through my bones, and into my skull. It was a constant, maddening presence. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was the last thing I heard as I drifted into a restless, dream-filled sleep, and the first thing I was aware of when I woke, my head aching and my nerves frayed. The next 2 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and mounting anxiety. The humming never stopped. Sometimes it would fade until it was almost inaudible, and a sliver of hope would rise in my chest, a desperate belief that it was finally over. But then it would return, sometimes stronger than before, a deep, resonant thrum that set my teeth on edge. The crew was falling apart. Tempers were short. Evan was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder at the boat we were towing. Gene had retreated into the engine room, surrounding himself with the familiar noise of his machinery. Even Marcus was starting to look strained. He spent most of his time in the wheelhouse, staring at his navigation charts, his face pale and drawn. He was pushing the engine hard, trying to get us back to port as fast as possible. It was no longer about the salvage. It was about getting rid of the damned boat that was tethered to us. Silas was the only one who seemed unaffected. He remained calm, but it wasn't a reassuring calm. It was a detached, almost serene acceptance of our fate. He did his work, he ate his meals, and he watched us. He looked at us with a kind of pity, as if we were men who had contracted a fatal disease and just didn't know it yet. On the third day of the tow, Marcus asked Evan and me to go aboard the Orion again. He wanted us to do a more thorough search, to find the source of that goddamn noise. He was convinced it had to be something simple, something we had overlooked, a loose piece of equipment, a pump that had somehow kicked on. The thought of setting foot on that boat again filled me with a cold, sickening dread. But an order was an order. We took the skiff across the choppy water, the rhythmic humming growing louder and more intense as we approached. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical force. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it. Climbing aboard the Orion felt like stepping into another world. The unnatural chill was still there, even more pronounced than before. The deck was covered in a thin layer of condensation that never seemed to evaporate. We split up, agreeing to search every inch of the vessel. I took the cabins and galley again, while Evan went to check the wheelhouse. I found nothing new in the crew's quarters. The half-eaten meal was still on the table, now with a fine layer of green mold growing on the bread. The open book still lay on the bunk, its pages stiff with sea damp. It was a place frozen in time, a monument to a moment of sudden, inexplicable departure. As I was about to leave, my foot snagged on a loose floorboard near the bunk. It was a small thing, but on a boat this unnervingly tidy, it fell out of place. Curiosity overriding my fear for a moment, I knelt and pried at the board. It came up easily. Beneath, it was a small, hidden compartment, not more than a foot square. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. This had to be where they hid their valuables, maybe a clue to what had happened. But the compartment didn't contain money or documents. It contained a single, thick, leather-bound journal. It wasn't the official ship's log. This was something personal. I lifted it out. The leather was cold and damp to the touch. I opened it to the first page. It was filled with the same neat, precise handwriting as the ship's logbook. The first several pages were normal. Notes on fishing grounds, observations about the weather, personal thoughts. But then the tone began to change. The entries became shorter, more frantic. The writer mentioned a strange humming sound they couldn't trace. He wrote about an unnatural fog that had appeared out of nowhere on a clear day. He described the crew becoming paranoid and withdrawn. Then, the handwriting devolved into the same crazed scrawl as that final entry in the wheelhouse log. The pages were no longer filled with words, but with those same disturbing, star-like symbols. They were drawn over and over again, obsessively, filling every inch of the paper. They seemed to squirm on the page, to shift and rearrange themselves at the edge of my vision. Staring at them made me feel dizzy, a wave of nausea washing over me. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. This wasn't the journal of a healthy crew. This was the journal of men who were losing their minds. And their descent into madness had started with a hum. Just then, a strangled cry came from the wheelhouse. It was Evan. I scrambled out of the cabin and ran, my feet slipping on the slick deck. I found him standing by the chart table, his face as white as a sheet. He was pointing at the glass of the large window that looked out over the bow. It wasn't there before, he whispered, his voice shaking. I swear to God, Leo, it wasn't there before. Etched into the inside of the glass, as if drawn with a diamond, was one of the symbols from the journal. It was a complex, multi-angled shape that seemed to defy geometry. It was sharp, precise, and utterly alien. We hadn't noticed it the first time we were in here, but there was no doubt it was there now. Had we missed it? Or had it appeared since our last visit? The very idea was insane, but in the oppressive, humming silence of that boat, insanity felt dangerously close. We didn't stay to look for the source of the noise. We fled. We scrambled back into the skiff and got away from the Orion as fast as we could. When we got back to the Sea Serpent, we told Marcus what we had found, the hidden journal, the symbol etched on the glass. I showed him the book. He flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each turn. He saw the progression from coherent thought to obsessive, mad scrawling. He didn't have a rational explanation for it this time. He just stared at the book, then looked back at the Orion, a dark shape bobbing silently at the end of the tow line. He looked like a man who was finally beginning to understand that he was up against something that his charts and his science couldn't explain. He looked scared. That night, the fog rolled in. It wasn't a normal sea fog. Normal fog is wispy. It moves and breathes with the wind. This was different. It descended upon us suddenly, a thick, suffocating wall of white. 1 minute the horizon was visible, the next it was gone, swallowed by a dense, silent blanket. It was oily and heavy, and it clung to the ship, muffling all sound. The world shrank to the few feet of deck visible around us. The Orion, though still tethered to us, was completely invisible, lost in the oppressive whiteness. The fog killed our electronics. The GPS screen fizzled and went dark. The satellite phone, our only link to the outside world, was dead. The radio emitted nothing but a soft, hissing static. We were utterly, completely alone. The silence was profound. The roar of our own engine seemed dampened, swallowed by the thick air. The only sound that cut through the oppressive quiet was the hum. Without the other ambient noises of the sea to distract from it, the humming from the Orion became the center of our universe. It was louder now, more insistent. It pulsed in the thick, still air, a monstrous, invisible heartbeat in the white void that surrounded us. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was the only thing left in the world. Panic began to set in. Gene, a man I had never seen show any emotion other than mild annoyance, had a wild, cornered look in his eyes. Evan refused to leave the galley, sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at nothing. Marcus paced the wheelhouse like a caged animal, constantly wiping the condensation from the inside of the windows, trying to peer into the impenetrable wall of white. I found Silas on the deck, staring out into the fog toward the invisible boat. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low, rhythmic chant. I got closer and realized he was repeating the same phrase over and over again. Out here, if you find a boat with no one aboard, you leave it for the sea. He said it without fear, without anger. He said it with the calm finality of a priest reciting a funeral rite. He had known this was coming. He had tried to warn us. And now, all he could do was bear witness. The fog stayed with us for a day, and then a night. We were navigating blind, relying on our compass and our prayers. The tension on board was stretched to a breaking point. We were all exhausted, all on edge, our minds worn down by the constant, inescapable humming and the claustrophobic isolation. Something had to give. It was near dawn on the second day of the fog when it happened. A loud, violent crack, like a gunshot, echoed across the ship, followed by the high-pitched shriek of tortured metal. We all rushed out onto the deck. The heavy winch that spooled the tow cable had seized. The thick steel cable, a line capable of pulling 50 tons, was tangled in a way I had never seen before. It was twisted and knotted, several strands snapped, the metal frayed and curling like torn thread. It was impossible. A winch doesn't just do that on its own. It looked like a giant, invisible hand had reached out of the fog and crushed it. As we stood there, staring at the ruined winch in stunned disbelief, I saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision near the stern rail. I turned my head, and in the thick, swirling fog, I saw a shape. It wasn't solid. It was a patch of fog that was somehow darker than the rest, a ripple in the air, a distortion. It had a vague, fluid form that moved with a terrifying, unnatural grace. It slid across the deck toward the rail, toward the invisible Orion, and then it was gone. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Evan let out a strangled gasp. "Did you see that?" He breathed, his eyes wide with terror. Before I could answer, a new sound began. It came from the Orion, a sound that sliced through the constant humming. It was a scraping noise, a long, slow, metallic shriek. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across a steel deck. We were no longer just scared. We were hunted. We were tethered to a boat that was not empty, and the thing that inhabited it was now aware that we were here. The game of subtlety was over. Marcus, spurred into action by pure terror, grabbed a massive set of bolt cutters. "We're cutting it loose," he yelled, his voice cracking. "We're cutting it loose right now." He and Jean ran to the stern, to the thick tow cable that was our last physical link to the Orion. But as they reached it, the scraping sound stopped. The humming intensified, the frequency rising until it felt like it was going to shake our teeth out of our skulls. And a new smell drifted out of the fog, carried from the other boat. It was a horrifying, gagging stench, a combination of ozone, rotten seaweed, and something else, a coppery, sweet smell that I instinctively knew was the smell of blood. The final escalation, the event that pushed us over the precipice from terror into sheer, mind-breaking horror, came that same morning. The fog remained, a suffocating prison of white. The tow cable was still attached. The winch was too mangled to release it, and the cable itself was too thick for the bolt cutters. We were stuck with it. The scraping sounds from the Orion had stopped, replaced once more by that maddening, soul-crushing hum. Marcus was a broken man. He was in the wheelhouse, slumped in his chair, staring at the dead instruments. He had made a decision based on logic and greed, and it had led us into a nightmare from which there was no logical escape. All his charts, all his experience, were useless now. It was Silas who finally proposed the unthinkable. His voice was steady, calm, as if he were suggesting we check the bait. "The humming," he said, looking at me and Evan. "It's coming from the hold. We never checked the hold, the main fish hold on the Orion. We had glanced into it on our first pass, but it had been empty, clean, and dark. We hadn't descended the ladder. We hadn't looked closely. The idea of going back onto that boat now was terrifying, but the thought of remaining tethered to it, waiting for whatever was on board to finally come for us, was even worse. We were driven by a desperate, irrational hope that if we could find the source of the hum, we could somehow stop it. That if we stopped the noise, we could break the spell. Armed with heavy flashlights and a pry bar, Evan and I agreed to go. It was a suicide mission, and we knew it. Jean flatly refused, locking himself in the engine room. Marcus didn't even seem to hear the proposal. It was just me, Evan, and Silas. Silas didn't come with us, but he helped us ready the skiff, his movements slow and deliberate. As we were about to climb down, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Some things aren't meant to be found," he said, his voice soft. "Just remember that." The trip across the 50 feet of water felt like a journey to the land of the dead. The humming grew with every foot, vibrating through the rubber of the skiff, up through our bodies. When we hooked onto the Orion, the entire vessel seemed to be thrumming like a massive tuning fork. Climbing aboard, we were met with that same unnatural cold and the gut-wrenching smell of ozone and decay. The main hatch to the fish hold was in the center of the deck. It was a heavy steel plate, battened down with thick latches. We had to use the pry bar to force them open, the screech of metal on metal sounding like a scream of protest. As the final latch gave way, a wave of foul, cold air washed over us, so noxious it made me gag. The humming that came from the darkness below was no longer just a sound. It was a physical pressure that pushed against us. We aimed our flashlights down into the black square of the hatch. A steel ladder was bolted to the side, descending into the darkness. "You first," Evan whispered, his voice trembling. I took a deep breath, the foul air searing my lungs, and started down the ladder. My flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the pitch-black hold. The walls were slick with a strange, oily residue that seemed to absorb the light. I reached the bottom, my boots sticking to the floor. The humming was deafening down here, a physical assault on my senses. Evan followed me down, his own flashlight beam dancing wildly around the confined space. The hold was bigger than I expected, and it was not empty. The steel walls, the floor, everything was coated in a thin, pulsating, bioluminescent film. It glowed with a sick, greenish-purple light, like a deep-sea creature. The light was faint, but it was enough to see that the entire interior of the hold was covered in those same alien symbols we had found in the journal and on the window. Except here they were massive, carved into the very metal of the ship. In the absolute center of the hold, directly beneath the hatch, was the source of the hum. It was an object roughly the size of a car engine, but it had no discernible shape. It was a chaotic mass of interlocking angles and impossible curves, made of a metal that was matte black, seeming to drink the light from our flashlights. It didn't look like it had been built. It looked like it had been grown. The symbols from the walls were repeated on its surface, glowing with a more intense inner light. Looking at it made my head spin. It was a shape that my brain refused to process, a piece of non-Euclidean geometry that had somehow forced its way into our reality. It hurt to look at. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over me, and I had to look away, my eyes watering. The object was what was making the sound. The hum was pouring out of it in waves, the air around it shimmering and distorting like a heat haze. And the smell was coming from the object, too. It was a smell of immense, ancient power. The smell of the space between stars. What is that thing? Evan stammered, his flashlight beam shaking violently. I had no answer. I could only stare at the pulsating, glowing film on the walls, at the impossible object that was the source of all our terror. This was not a piece of machinery. This was not something human. We had stumbled onto something that did not belong in our world. The crew of the Orion hadn't gone mad. They had seen this. They had been in the presence of this thing, and it had broken their minds before it erased them. We knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the steel floor beneath our feet, that we had to get out. We had to get away from this thing. We turned to leave, to scramble back up the ladder into the relative safety of the fog. But it was too late. As if sensing our intention to flee, the humming suddenly changed. The low thrum pitched upward, rising into a piercing, deafening shriek that vibrated through the hold, through our very atoms. The glowing film on the walls flared, illuminating the entire space in its sickly, purple light. The symbols carved into the walls and onto the object began to glow with a blinding intensity. Then the storm hit. It wasn't a gradual build-up. It was instantaneous. One moment, the sea outside was relatively calm. The next, a hurricane-force wind slammed into the Orion, and the boat lurched violently, throwing Evan and me against the slimy walls of the hold. A torrential downpour began, the rain hammering against the deck above us like machine gun fire. The sea erupted. Through the open hatch, we could see the sky, which had turned a bruised, sickly black. Waves, monstrous and black, crashed over the deck, sending torrents of freezing seawater cascading down into the hold. The shriek from the object in the center of the room rose to an impossible, mind-shattering crescendo. This was no natural storm. It was being generated by the thing in the hold. It was a defense mechanism, a tantrum, the line. I screamed at Evan over the roar. The tow line snapped. I could feel it. The constant, steady pull from a sea serpent was gone. We were adrift now, alone in the heart of the storm on this cursed ship. We had to get out of the hold, get back on deck. We scrambled for the ladder, slipping and sliding on the wet, pulsating floor. The boat was being thrown about like a toy, the waves crashing over us. I grabbed onto the ladder and started to climb, the cold steel rungs slick with seawater and the alien slime. Evan was right behind me. As I neared the top of the ladder, a wave of immense size slammed into the side of the Orion, rolling the ship almost onto its side. I clung to the ladder for dear life, my knuckles white, my body dangling over the shrieking, glowing abyss of the hold. Below me, Evan lost his grip. He let out a terrified cry as he fell. He didn't fall to the floor. He fell toward the object. He landed near the base of the impossible machine. The air around, it was distorting wildly now, shimmering like a faulty projection. Evan pushed himself up, trying to crawl away from it, but it was as if the object had its own gravity. It was pulling him in. "Leo!" he screamed, his voice filled with a terror that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. I watched, helpless, from the ladder. He reached out a hand to me, his eyes pleading. As his body slid closer to the object, his arm passed into the field of distorted air around it. In his arm, it changed. It didn't dissolve or burn. It just stopped making sense. His fingers seemed to stretch and multiply. His skin liquefied and flowed like water, the bones beneath twisting into impossible angles. It was a sight so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to every law of physics and biology that my mind couldn't process it. It was like watching reality itself come apart at the seams. Evan's scream of terror turned into a gurgling, inhuman shriek of pure, agonizing madness as his entire body was pulled into the shimmering field. For a single, horrific moment, I saw his form unravel, his humanity dissolving into a chaotic, swirling vortex of light and color and raw, screaming chaos. Then he was gone. He had been unmade. The sight broke something in my mind. A primal, animal fear took over, overriding all thought. I didn't even feel my arms and legs as I scrambled the rest of the way up the ladder and collapsed onto the deck, the freezing rain and waves crashing over me. I lay there for a second, gasping, my mind a blank slate of shock. The hole below me was a swirling vortex of purple light and impossible noise. I had to get away. I looked up, and through the driving rain and the towering waves, I saw the sea serpent. It was only 30 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. It was heaving on the waves, its lights a beacon of safety in the raging blackness. I could see figures on the deck. Marcus, Silas. They were staring at the Orion, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow pouring from its open hold. I didn't think. I just ran. I scrambled across the violently pitching deck of the Orion, my only thought to get off this boat, to get away from the thing that had just erased my friend from existence. I reached the rail, gauged the distance to the sea serpent as it rose on a massive swell, bringing its deck almost level with mine. And I leaped. I sailed through the air, through the screaming wind and the stinging rain. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I was going to fall short into the churning, black water between the two vessels. But my fingers snagged on the sea serpent's rail. My body slammed hard against the steel hull, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Hands grabbed me. Strong hands. It was Silas and Marcus, pulling me over the rail, dragging me onto the deck of my own ship. I collapsed onto the wet steel, coughing up seawater, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was safe. I was back. I pushed myself up and looked back at the Orion. It was already drifting away, swallowed by the storm and the darkness. The shrieking had stopped. The hellish purple light from its hold was fading, and the only sound was the roar of the wind and the sea. The boat was just a dark shape, growing smaller and smaller, before it finally vanished into the maelstrom. It was gone, taking its impossible cargo, the memory of its crew, and what was left of Evan with it. Marcus was screaming at the helm. "Get us out of here. Full power. Get us away from it." No one needed to be told twice. Jean pushed the old engine harder than it had ever been pushed before, and the sea serpent turned its bow away from the storm, fleeing into the darkness. No one looked back. No one spoke of what we had seen. There were no words for it. How do you describe watching a man get unraveled by a piece of geometry that shouldn't exist? How do you explain a storm that was born from a machine that hummed? The storm died as quickly as it had appeared. Within an hour, the wind had calmed, the sea had settled, and the unnatural fog had lifted. We were left under a sky filled with a terrifying number of stars, the water calm and quiet. It was as if nothing had happened. But the empty space on the deck where Evan should have been was proof that it had. The silence on our ship was heavier and more profound than any silence we had felt from the Orion. The journey back to port was a silent, grim procession. We were 4 men now, not 5. We moved like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes, each of us locked away in our own private hell of memory. We all knew what we had seen, but to speak of it would be to give it a name, to make it real, and we couldn't bear that. We concocted a story, a believable lie. Evan was lost in the storm. A rogue wave had washed him overboard while he was trying to secure the tow line. A tragic but all too common accident at sea. We rehearsed the details until they sounded plausible. The shared falsehood, a fragile shield against the unspeakable truth. Marcus aged 10 years and 2 days. The confident, pragmatic captain was gone, replaced by a haunted, broken man who flinched at shadows. When we reached Kodiak, the lie held. There was an inquiry, questions were asked, but our story was consistent. We were grieving crewmates, and no one had any reason to doubt us. I took my share of the money from the catch, packed my bag, and walked off the Sea Serpent for the last time. I never looked back. I left Alaska a week later. I moved to the Midwest, as far from the ocean as I could get. I found a job in a warehouse, a place of solid concrete floors and predictable fluorescent lighting. I needed the stability. I needed to be surrounded by things that were solid and made sense. But you can't run from a memory like that. It follows you. I can't sleep most nights. When I do, I dream of a shrieking, purple light. I dream of impossible shapes that hurt my eyes. I see Evan's face, his eyes wide with terror, and I hear his final, inhuman scream as reality tore him apart. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the house is perfectly quiet, I can almost feel it, a low, deep vibration in my bones. The memory of the hum. It has been years, but the fear has never faded. It's a cold presence that lives inside me now. I don't know what we found out there in the empty expanse of the Pacific. I don't know where the Orion came from or what its purpose was. Was it a probe? A prison? A weapon? Or was it just something that had fallen into our world by mistake? I will never have the answers. All I know for sure is that humanity is a fragile, fleeting thing, adrift on a vast, dark ocean of things we can't possibly understand. There are rules for a reason. There are warnings passed down through generations because someone, somewhere, learned the hard way. They learned that there are voids in the world, hollow places where things go missing, and it is not our place to go looking for them. Some things, when they are lost, are meant to stay that way. The sea is deep, and it is old, and it keeps its secrets well. We should let it. Out here, if you find a boat with no one aboard, you leave it for the sea.